Hello. Good evening and welcome, although I have to say good evening and welcome is trite. I mean, it's just a cliche, right? I could start by a joke. Usually before I do a lecture, I pace around thinking, how do I start the lecture? And I was pacing around thinking I would say that I was pacing around trying to figure out how to start the lecture. And you probably, if you know me, you know that I'm going to be talking about how a piece of music starts. It's complicated because Janacek, to get into it, is without conventions. So he would never start a piece by saying welcome and good evening. It would just start, it's like opening the door and there's an argument already. In fact, starting a piece of music is nothing like starting a lecture, but it can be like starting a play. So think about great openings of plays. Some of my favorites. Here's my all-time favorite first line of a play, and I think you probably know it. Who's there? Hamlet, right? Who's there? How about this one? You may or may not. This one is a little bit strange. What have you done with the scissors? Yeah, that's the homecoming of Harold Pinter. Oh, look at that. Okay, Harold Pinter is a little bit like Janacek because Harold Pinter would listen to people in bars, restaurants, on the street, write things down, keep a notebook of what they said, and then it would become his play in some way with a lot of work. And Janacek, as you'll see, did that. Here's another beginning of a play by Pinter. Is that you, Petey? That's like who's there a little bit. And the second line is, Petey, is that you? And the third line is, Petey? It's great, it's great. Now, before we get to the quartet, I would like you to listen to the first phrase of Janacek's violin sonata. Now, there are very few things that start that way in music. You want to do that again? It's kind of disturbing. It's kind of like he takes some notes and flings it at you. Play it like... Okay, now let's take a look at that. I'm going to discuss that for 20 minutes. Actually, it's important that the first note just sits there. Can you just play the first note? Nothing happens, right? Okay, thank you. What it doesn't do is establish a time signature, a tempo. It doesn't do anything. It's just a shocking note. And there's a famous sonata by Beethoven that starts like this. So what's important about the opening here is that you don't have, because that would take away all the drama, right? What you have is this. And then when this happens, you have the key, C minor. You don't have to know it's C minor, but you have a key. And you have a rhythm. And what happens next is silence. So you're thinking, dee da 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 dum. Oh, I have a mic'd heart. No, in other words, you're feeling a pulse in silence. In fact, there's a line from Pinter's Homecoming, which is, you have never heard such silence. So one of my favorite lines. And with Beethoven, even though it's strange and starts with a note that has no rhythm, very quickly you have a key and a pulse. This thing by Janacek sounds just wild. But actually, it's also very specific. It's all one chord, which is this, which then immediately resolves. And in fact, it's not only that, and this is surprising because it's showing you that just a crazy gesture like that, he thought a lot about it. He was not some crazy eccentric like he's often described. And now if you didn't know that now, you know he's described as a crazy eccentric, so that was counterproductive. But anyway, he's not a crazy eccentric. But it's the same notes repeated. And then up an octave. But instead of, he goes, sorry, one is surprising note. So it's the same thing. And if you put it all together, and then it goes. So it actually is a chord, one chord, which he takes a rhythm and really literally throws it at you. And this is a clue to Janacek's kind of music. He really, more than any composer, probably in history of music, is a totally unique, self-made composer, somebody whose writing is really unlike practically anyone at all. And the only things he's at all close to are a little bit Debussy, a little bit Mussorgsky, but he really is his own person. And one of the things that got him to be who he was is that he did walk around like Harold Pinter, way before Harold Pinter, walk around with a book, a diary, and notate everything as music. So he would hear people talk, he would notate it as music, he would hear, actually I have some of it here. And it's reams and reams and reams of this, and not just people talking, but mosquitoes, the dawn, waves. He wrote everything down in musical notation. So the first one is he hears a young lady at a train station, and she says to her friend, "We will stand here, and I know he's not coming." And her friend says, "Doesn't matter." So the friend, by the way, I checked my Czech, so is anyone here fluent in Czech? I'm really trying hard. I'm going to do it in Czech because there's no point in using English with Janacek. It's just terrible. So he wrote down that this woman says, "Budem tady stát," and then she goes, "A já vím, že nepřijde." And her friend says, "To je jedno," on one note, "To je jedno." And then underneath it he writes this, "Budem tady stát, a víš, že nepřijde, to je jedno." And I'll play with just music. So it could be from one of his operas, but it isn't. It's just a notation. There are thousands of these. Here's another one. He heard some young lady say to a soldier, she burst out and said, "You weren't there." Sort of the same problem. And it's "Tis nebetam." And then later in the same sketchbook he writes, so he's taking things from life and making little fragments and collecting them, just like Pinter would hear a conversation and write it down. And that's one of the reasons that Pinter's plays have things, like the opening, I don't have the whole thing here, but "Is that you, Petey? Petey, is that you, Petey?" And then Petey says, "What?" And she says, "Petey." And he says, "Yes, it's me." And she says, "Are you back?" Now, that's a kind of a hard thing to think of, but if you're listening to the way people talk, that's the way people talk. Now, aside from those little snippets of the way people talk, this is dawn, D-A-W-N. He decided to write down dawn. Okay, how does this work? Does he hear that? Now, we can't be sure, because it seems like he did, the way he writes about music. But he also, and this will be a thread connecting all of this, he also had this ability to so deeply internalize the emotional quality of what he was experiencing that it could become sound for him. It became rhythm. And rhythm is the first thing, because rhythm for him was a special world different from every other composer, as you'll see in a moment, and you'll be hearing. He made up rhythmic words based on Czech words. Sčasovka is one of them. Believe me, I had to study a little Czech this week, but Sčasovka is a little unit of rhythm that so many American and British musicologists have tried to define in English. And based on what his music is and what he writes about music, it seems like, Michael Beckerman, for example, who is a big Janacek expert, he calls it a timelet, like a rhythmicized unit of time, a timelet. Some people call it a unit of energy. I've decided to call it time particle, because I think that a particle makes you think of physics. It makes you think of the body and things, and a particle is waiting to do something. It's part of it's in the nucleus. So I think it works perfectly. As you'll hear, there are a lot of these particles that are rhythmic energy. Now, moving along with this, here is another thing. This is, quote, "I stand on the shore at high tide. The swarm of waves rises higher and higher. Every wave shouts its own motif." And he writes this. Well, it could be. Especially, which could also be, it sounds like something from the quartet, right? It sounds like a lot of his music. This is a mosquito, which is the least interesting one. But of course, that interval makes the mosquito slightly Slavic. And it's possible that that's what they do there. I mean, I think Chopin's mosquito probably, or that could be a lot of people's mosquito, actually. So he wrote those down like that. And he said, here's a little bit from his diary, "It is time to move on from imitating a nightingale with a flute. The grain harvest, when done, has its own jubilant musical naturism. The atmosphere in a pub has its own tonal din, as does a group of drunken recruits." In other words, it's all music. And then he criticizes Chopin. He says, "Chopin's noble," and he loved Chopin, "Chopin's noble new contrapuntal forms arise only from the piano." So in other words, he didn't like that music comes from instruments or even from voices singing. It has to come from voices talking in real life and things happening, and that's where he took all of his musical ideas. Now, before we get to the quartet, just sitting there, we need to hear a tiny little bit of vocal music of Janacek, because since he wrote down all these melodies from real life, speech melodies, people talking, and then he would harmonize it, you would be correct in assuming that his vocal music and his opera writing, but also his songs and other pieces with voice, are based on that concept of notating the way people really talk, turning that into something musical. And this is an excerpt you're going to hear where it's very clear that he's only doing two things, right, with hardly any introduction to Janacek. One is the voice is exactly what you would expect. It is talking on the pitch. It's beautiful singing, but it's talking on pitch with rhythm that is like real life rhythm. There's no repetition of phrases in the voice. In the instrument, there's tons of repetition, because Janacek worked by taking an idea from real life and repeating it, and changing it, and entangling it with another idea, and then it would work itself out. In fact, that image, you'll hear that in the music very clearly. He'll take a rhythm that comes from inside, a little rhythmicized unit, a particle, and started spinning with with a choice of notes. And the notes are not necessarily a normal harmony that we would, by normal I mean a conventional harmony. They may or may not be, because he doesn't think of them that way. And then it might get hooked into another harmony, and that one takes over, just like particles interacting. And over that, the voice, without any repetition, while the piano is like obsessively repeating, the voice is just speaking. And this is a little bit of Diary of One Who Vanished. It's going to be sung here by Ian Bostrich, and the pianist is the composer Thomas Addis. Wait a minute, sorry. The wrong thing happened there. Here we go. Spins.
che mi accerciasto, l'ave certo se c'è. Sota por impierat, spiram pamia hori.
So you can tell this is actually very unusual music. There is no spot in this very long piece where you get a traditional melodic structure. It's all related to real speech. But the piano, this is just with piano, this piece, is continually making these rhythmic units and turning them into some kind of fabric. In fact, one of the things that may have influenced Janacek, but he went in a completely different direction, is Stravinsky, some of Stravinsky's music. Janacek was much older than Stravinsky. I mean, Stravinsky was born in 1882, and Janacek was born in 1854. Janacek had a much more provincial and conventional life than Stravinsky until he was 62, which I think is very important because I am 62. He wrote some pieces, and those pieces did well, especially Yenufa, which he wrote before he turned 62. But nobody knew who he was, and he didn't, in the general musical world, and he didn't have any real success, and he wasn't writing that much. But two things happened. Yenufa, his first opera, was given a hugely successful performance in Prague when Janacek was 62. It made him extremely famous right away. And right after that, he fell in love with a 26-year-old. Now, you should know, and I don't want to get into this, but anyway, Janacek got married to a woman who was much younger than he was, way before all this. When he was 20-something, she was 16, and her father was his boss. Okay, let's leave it alone. I know this is big stuff right now, but it was a long time ago. Anyway, he fell in love with Kamila Zduslova, who was married, and happily married. And Janacek wrote 722 letters to her between the age of 62 and 74. And I'll read a little bit of those letters, but this piece you're going to hear some of is called Intimate Letters. This piece is based exactly on his feelings from his relationship with her. His relationship with her was pretty much in his mind. He wrote the 722 letters. She wrote some back. He took her to premieres. Her husband usually didn't seem to care. This crazy old guy's taking his wife around is fine. They figured maybe they would get some money out of this famous guy at some point in his will, which is a very big story, which I won't get into, but yes, they did try to do that. She didn't know anything about music. She didn't care about his music, but he did take her to some premieres. His wife and he had already arranged for a complete divorce, except that they lived together and she cooked for him. And managed to be insanely jealous all the time. I don't know why she did this to herself, but she did. But the obsessiveness of these letters is part of it. What you just heard, The Diary of One Who Vanished, was the first piece he wrote about this woman, Kamila. And he wrote every piece he wrote from age 62 to his death at 74. Every piece he wrote, which is most of his great music, is about her or dedicated to her. The operas, except for even the very last opera, which has no women in it, makes references in the text to someone who must be her. So, now to the quartet. Let's just hear the opening of the first movement, thinking about the following things. Declamation. Instead of a melody, you get melodic declamation. You get the sense of it coming from speech in terms of its rhythm. And then you also have, in the cello, right at the beginning, you'll hear a kind of ecstatic trill. You think of it as ecstatic? Yeah, okay, yeah. Except for Janacek, probably the only other composer who writes trills as if they are melodic ideas. They are as important as anything else, is Beethoven. And there are a lot of weird similarities between them. Okay, let's hear the opening of the quartet. Okay, let's stop there for now. Thank you. So there are very simple layers. Now, I didn't play the Stravinsky for you, but I will eventually. There are very simple layers, the trill, the dee-da-da-dee-da-da-da-dum. And as soon as you get into this world, it stops. And you have a viola solo that is a completely different mood and a different tempo and everything else. And for those of you who are not totally aware of the sound that was coming out of the viola, that's called sul ponticello. It's playing on the bridge. Let's just take a moment for, this is true for every composer who uses it. Do you want to just play a little bit of it without ponticello and then with? When she plays with ponticello, it means close to the bridge. That's what sul ponticello, basically on the bridge. And it creates a very eerie, thin sound with some overtones, almost electronic sounding. Okay, and then with the ponticello. Okay, now what is that? That's her. Now, how do we know that? First of all, if you read 722 letters, which I almost did, it's kind of clear that everything in this piece is about their relationship, but there's something else. Janacek doesn't like to use conventions if possible. So even the opening, this thing, it's not exactly clear if this is in a key or what key it is. And then it seems to, so it could possibly be in C minor. It could possibly be hovering between G minor and C minor. But you know, normally I'm very interested in that sort of thing, but with Janacek, that's not the point. He's using intervals, and it's speaking, and it comes to a cadence because he believes in tonality, in mode and key. He doesn't like atonality at all. He never uses it. So even when things are very dissonant, which is a word he didn't use except for melodic dissonance, even when something is dissonant, it's always expressive of a feeling rather than a convention. Now you say, isn't Beethoven an expression of a feeling rather than a convention? Yes, of course. But the difference is that he breaks all of the rules all the time, just holding on tight to what's left of music, Janacek, I mean. And so, for example, this thing, we know this is her because he wrote in his letters that he called her my gypsy. She wasn't a gypsy. She was Jewish. He didn't ever address that directly. Maybe his wife said it all the time. But he called her his dark gypsy. If you look at pictures of the two of them, which you can easily find on your phone, but not right now. Her name is Kamila Stuslova. It's kind of hard to get what he's saying because she's really something in his mind. She doesn't fit his image at all. But anyway, he uses an actual gypsy scale. Now, there are quite a few, but there are some scales that are known to be or thought to be Hungarian gypsy scales. And I have to tell you right off the bat that that's a highly debated issue in musicology. I know it's not on the tip of everybody's mind right now. But there's a difference between Hungarian-sounding gypsy music and actual Romanish folk music. They are not the same thing. But for most of the 19th century, even in Hungary and Czechoslovakia or Bohemia, even in those places, they were confused by what was authentically gypsy and what was not. And that didn't get cleared up until Bartók cleared it up in the 20th century. But this scale is one of the authentic scales associated with gypsy music. This is one of the only places where Janacek writes a melody that actually can fit into something, and it's a gypsy scale, and he calls her his gypsy, and it's all by herself. She's playing, look at her, come on. No, I know, sorry. No, that has nothing to do with it. But it works perfectly, and there's another reason we know. Abigail is playing a viola, but his first idea for that instrument was a viola d'amore, which is a very specific viola of love. It's a very specific Baroque instrument, which has many strings, more than that. It has sympathetic strings. It means strings that just vibrate running underneath the other strings. It doesn't move. You can't do what you can do on a modern viola or even a Baroque viola. And so it was not possible to use the viola d'amore for this piece. It just didn't work. But we knew that he wanted the viola d'amore to be her in the Gypsy scale, and that's what that is. So moving on from there, you heard that he keeps reiterating the same things. Now, one of the things Janacek does is repeat a lot, but he repeats always on a different level of harmony, which is how people are in real life. Petey, is that you? Petey, is that you? Petey? It's like, it's repetitious, but each time it means something else. And each time it's in a different level of pitch. Petey, yes? Petey? Now this is an exercise. Actors do this all the time. You say the same sentence 25 ways. Each way has to mean something else. And they can be very complex because, as Janacek knew and wrote in his diary, the way you use your voice when you speak is more important than the words you're saying to most people listening. And we all know how true that is with animals, right? With an animal, you can't say, that was bad, don't do that again. It doesn't work. So I know one person trains her dog that way. It doesn't do anything. So that's what a lot of this repetition is about. And now you're about to hear this motif. And then it becomes... This is a lot like what you heard in the piano part, right? In that piano accompaniment. This kind of thing is what I'm calling the time particle, which is what Janacek called something that has to do with time rhythmicized, a little unit of time, a stasovka. I'm only saying that word because it appears, when people write about Janacek in English, they give up and they write stasovka. So when you write about Janacek, you said, I heard this lecture, he talked about stasovka all the time. That way you'll do the same thing. So that little thing does not have to be any particular chord. And usually what it is part of a harmony that might be recognizable or some notes that we become accustomed to. And then they shift in some way. Now, for example, I could analyze all these chords, but analysis is not very Janacekian. But for example, if I wanted to analyze that, I would say that you have a fifth here, and you also have a fifth here. So we have fifths. So what? Well, I mean, it's, in other words, here too. I could say there's a chord and the ninth. But normally when we analyze things in music, we say the name of a chord, this is a ninth above it, this is a seventh. It just doesn't matter to him because he doesn't use things that way. It would be like looking at something in English and looking for nouns and adjectives, but he doesn't use them as a noun or an adjective. How do they get connected? They get connected by common tones, by pivot notes. So if this is a harmony and this is a harmony, and these are the same note, let's say, then the next harmony will do this. It'll take that note and shift it somewhere else. Now, for those of you who are listening to the podcast, and you had no idea what I was saying, even these two, which are not quite next to each other, have one note in common. That's very important. If you hear that, do you hear that? Okay, if you hear that, that's the system. It's that simple, except it becomes very complex. He calls, he wrote a book of harmony. He calls this entanglement and disentanglement. That is not the same thing as functioning harmony. If the functioning harmony says, and you can surprise people with a deceptive idea, or even more deceptive. But all of those relationships function. To do this and keep this one note, and then do, and then maybe, and eventually, and then, now he's not the only one who did this, but he did it in a unique way. Because Chopin might do something like that, and Wagner too, but it's, on the surface it's like that, and underneath it there's a deep underpinning of function, of harmony. With Chopin, the harmony is there, the tradition is there, and the surface of it, the surface of the music is glittering and complex and richly chromatic, but the surface is there. With Janacek, the surface is it. There's one surface here, there's another surface there, and there's another surface here. Each one of them is a surface playing on their own path. They're each particles or tunes. Now, there are times that it seems like you're hearing a melody with chords. We'll get to that because it's still different. So let's hear now, knowing that, from the very beginning of this movement to wherever I told you to stop. Okay, now we're going to move ahead in this movement to another excerpt. And I think it's going to become clear that every little excerpt you hear, when you hear melody, it is a fragment of something overheard. You're not going to get a full-blown melody. Even in the operas, they are built on speech ideas. And there are some of them that blow into full-blown melodies, but they get there through a process that is related to drama and speech more than it is related to traditional melodic arcs. So you're going to hear a tune, and you're going to hear this, that almost sounds like it could be a traditional form, but not in the context, as you'll see. And then it gets repeated quite a bit. Then you will also hear another one of those Stasovkas. I knew nobody would scream out Stasovka. And that would be really weird to have in New York, even in New York City. Someone goes, Stasovka! But maybe somebody will later today. Okay, and then you have in this, can we just hear the second violin alone for a moment, right at this meno mosso? Skipping a little bit. Okay, thank you. And then could we hear the viola? Okay, now let's hear those two together. Okay, now, that is not an accompaniment to anything. And you can tell that it's not. What it is, it has to do with nature and the way he hears nature. Let's say you're directing a film. You're a film director. And you're shooting a scene in which two people are walking through the woods talking to each other. You have a lot of choices here in the sound. Forget what the picture looks like for a moment. This is the tricky part. In the sound. Because let's say it's people can just listen to this film, as an audio thing. How loud are the woods? Do you hear a bird going or something? Do you hear a frog? Do you hear something rush by in the background? Do you hear animals making the strange sounds, the growling sounds that they might make if you walk too close by? Or do you not? Do you hear the sound of their feet on twigs breaking, or is that too much? Now, if you've experienced a hearing aid, you might know that sometimes all of that is the same volume. There's a problem in a restaurant, right? You hear the glasses and you hear the sounds of everybody. Everything's the same volume unless you have some kind of moderated version of it. The film director has to decide the sticks breaking, the sound of the trees, the wind rustling, how much of that is atmosphere and background, and how much do you want it to be part of the texture? And if what if the idea is that it's getting scarier and scarier? Maybe those sounds get louder. Maybe you manipulate the listener in a way by making it loud. Well, for Janacek, that is how he writes music, in that these sounds are not accompaniments. For example, in a way, something like this. You could think of it as and then it is an accompaniment, because if I go, that is a convention. It's a convention that goes way back to Haydn, and even a little before with C.P.E. Bach. And that actually is similar in that it is a rhythmicized unit. It's a chord, and if on the guitar you're strumming, you are immediately rhythmicizing that chord. That's a rhythmicization. So what Janacek does is he rhythmicizes ideas, but they are not traditional harmonies. They don't function like harmonies, and they are in the foreground. They take as much importance as the tune. They are structured around on note choices that are emotional, not functional. They're emotional. It's a huge difference. Okay, and I'll get more and more into that. So let's hear this bit from the Meno to wherever I told you to stop. That? How could you not? That was great. Could you just play to do it by yourself? This is what I mean. It is not an accompaniment. It doesn't always accompany, even in a harmonic world. It's not subservient. And not only that, it's written to be very loud and very angry, and it competes for your attention with the so-called melody, because it's about how he feels, not an accompaniment to make the tune pretty. Could you just do that? It's just unbelievable. Yeah, okay. All right, so you believe me, it's not background music? Okay, good. So now, during that passage, harmonically, he does some amazing things. We have this in the viola, and this in the cello, and this in the second violin, and first violin. And that gives you lots of fifths. But of course, music always gives you a lot of fifths. You can rearrange fifths into thirds. You can rearrange them into seconds sometimes. So, for example, you could also hear it this way. Or at one point we have, if this were Copland, then we would be hearing two chords, A major and B major. And he would do it like this. And you would feel, and what's important about what I'm doing here is that the reference has to do, the detail is the spacing, the resonance. They're far apart. The B major is connected to only B major, and the A major is resonant down on the bottom of the piano only to A major. But here we get in the cello, and this note is important. So the A is, and the B major chords are dispersed among all of them, just flung out there like that first sonata. So he doesn't, I shouldn't say he doesn't, what he does do is he takes the notes that he's using and he ignores whether they might be thought of in a traditional way. And he puts them, he entwines them. That's another word he uses. He entwines chords and he lets them disentangle. Of course, he makes them disentangle. Now, he also believes, though, that there's always a primary simple chord and subordinate harmonies. That's how he hears it. So in his mind, there's something more important that is the foundation, and then everything else is happening kind of inside it and eventually will resolve. All right, now, we have one more excerpt from this, which is, again, I think it's getting clearer and clearer, and then we'll get to the second movement. What's going on? There's a high fluttering of birds or something, very high in the first two. Can we just hear the first two violins? Well, there only are two, the two violins. Okay, it's not exactly a trill because the notes aren't next to each other, they're further apart, but it's like a trill. So, and then you'll hear that the Gypsy Solo in the not viola d'amore, or viola d'amore not, is trying to say something. And the cello is giving us a foundation which, as you'll see when I read you some of the letters, might represent the ground, the earth. You've got to stand on something while your mind is reeling like violins and your heart is fluttering like a viola. Let's hear that. That's the end of the first movement. Now, the second movement, I have to read you a little bit from his letters to her in order to understand. I mean, the third movement. We're doing the third. Sorry. The second movement we're doing, which is the third, has a very important illustration or depiction, or I should say maybe manifestation of something in one of the letters. Over and over in his letters to her, he says, "When I told you I loved you, the ground shook." Or sometimes he says, "When I kissed you for the first time, the earth trembled." He keeps changing what happened, but it's always the earth trembled, the ground shook. And let me read you a little bit of this. At this point, when he wrote this piece, he was 74 and she was 37. But as I say, there's no indication that they actually had a relationship, just that he did. Now at 3 o'clock, the Moravian Quartet, that's the string quartet, should be coming to my place to play your composition. He calls it hers because she inspired it. I'm already panting to hear it. Pause, then he comes back to the letter. They played it. They played the third movement, and Camilla, it will be beautiful, strange, unrestrained, inspired, a composition beyond all the usual conventions. Together, I think we will triumph. It is my first composition in which sprang from directly experienced feeling. Before then, I composed only from things remembered. This piece, Intimate Letters, was written in fire. Earlier pieces only in hot ash. Then in the next letter he says, I'm delighted with the quartet after our stories. At this point he was calling it love letters. He changed it to intimate letters. I was anxious whether I would climb higher with that piece, and I went higher. How could I not revel in joy at the time when it seemed to me that the earth was shaking beneath me, that the sun was rocking, that everything around me was turning in confusion? How was that furnace possible? 2 words crossed out. Ever to be cooled, it makes every note glow. Then they flow like steel radiates heat when it's hot. You will certainly erase those lines. Well, do what you will, and some places whisper so tenderly, Well, a confession of love and a language of longing. The language of longing never satisfied. You'll erase those lines too. That's what it says. Do what you will. It is the truth. Okay, you get the feeling for what this guy's like. How do I know he would talk that way? Well, believe it or not, there are no recordings of him talking, but there are lots of descriptions of him talking. And the best one says that he talked like his music. And he talked like the way he thought everybody was speaking in short fragments that were always highly emotional. So I would read it, do what you will. And some places whisper so tenderly. Well, a confession of love and a language of longing. A language of longing, never satisfied. Something like that. That's what his music sounds like. That was fun for me. Okay. Okay, now let's hear the opening of the third movement. Okay, thank you. Beautiful. Now you might think, okay, there's a tune and some chords. But all those chords are not related to any convention. They're very hollow and weird. And to point that out to you, I will play it with conventional harmonies. It would sound like this. Ready? Sorry. Now let's hear that again. In fact, I really think that he only picked chords in the moment, each one. Because, for example, the first few chords of this, also it's very important with Janacek that the violin is so much higher. The tune is in a different place because he thought in layers and in stratified sound. So the violin is way up there, and they are way lower, which is not a typical thing. It's typical for Janacek. And in his orchestration, even with Janúfa, he often wrote very high wind parts and then very low strings, or he wrote for trombones and piccolos at the same time. And people thought that he didn't know how to orchestrate. And believe it or not, at the big premiere of the first great performance of his life, they reorchestrated a lot of it against his say-so and made it conventional sounding. People loved it. Okay. Now, this first few chords really could be heard as whole tones. In other words, it's kind of Debussy-esque, maybe, but he wasn't thinking. He didn't know Debussy's music and he studied it, but he didn't need to know it to do that. In fact, he said, I liberated my music from convention before I heard any Debussy. He knew people would say something like that. He probably knew I would say that. Okay, and then, and then you have, and this is a good example of how weird it is. Right here, this is a minor chord. But we don't hear it that way. In other words, that's a triad. Does it sound like a triad to you? Not really. It is one. So if you said yes, it's okay. But it's not a normal triad. It's spelled strangely. It's spelled as a C flat, a G, and an F flat. But if I called it an E, a G, and a B, but in order for that to be an E minor chord, he would have had to harmonize it like this. Those are the same notes. You see what I mean? But he doesn't do... I mean, it's awful to do this, but he does this. And the other thing is, with Janacek, every note has to be in the same place. You know, let's say you're playing a song on the guitar. You play an E minor chord. You play a G major chord. The way you're playing that chord is a collection of notes called G major or E minor. They are not in a particular position for a piece unless you're playing fingered, like classical guitar or some form of guitar where the actual placement of the notes matters. Otherwise, you're playing chords that are always in the same position. This F chord is always in that position. With Janacek, you can't summarize the music that way because like that Copeland chord I played, where the note is in the register is just as important as what the note is. And he's one of the first composers to do that. The only other composers who were doing it in his lifetime were 20 and 30 years younger than he was, like Stravinsky and Hindemith, and then later Bartók. He was born in 1854. So it's really, in fact, he started to have his music played at new music concerts where the other composers were Stravinsky and Hindemith and people like that, who were kids for him. But he had already done so many of these weird things. Now, I have to read something to you that he wrote about what is a chord. You know, if you look up a chord in a dictionary, a music dictionary or any kind of dictionary, most of the time it'll say a chord is, if you're looking at music anyway, a chord is two or more notes sounded together. Fine. That's not very emotional definition. But there is also the meaning of chord in English, which has nothing to do with any other language. Oh, that struck a chord. That means I resonate with it. That's closer to Janacek, except that's English. So here are some of the things that he said. For me, a chord is a being come alive, a blood-stained flower of the musical art. I know when I write it that pain grips my heart, that the heart moans, wails, falls hard on the ground, crushes, is fragmented by the mist, hardens into granite. What do I care for the borrowed attributes of beautiful or ugly? Okay, that's one definition of a chord. Here's another comment on chords. Against the expressive chord, now he means his chords, against the expressive chord stands a chord acoustically calculated, smoothed out, aesthetically refined, grown cold. A chord made glib through education. That's pretty powerful, right? That's true of a lot of things. It's like writing can be made glib through education, right? Everything can be made glib through education. You could also you take a course in Janacek and suddenly you realize you've become glib and you become unglib. You have to get reglibbed later. Okay, he also says, what is a chord? I recognized in the chord the expression of several affects coming into contact with one another, an expression clinging to life, erupting out of life itself rather than out of pure sounds. A chord is an expression like, for instance, an involuntary movement of the hands. We wring our hands in pain. We join them in prayer. We use them to embrace someone. We raise them to the sun. We threaten severely with them. We defend ourselves mercilessly with our hands. So in other words, it's like that. He just has a chord, and then he uses it, and it gets entangled with another chord, and then it untangles with the chord. It so happens that he also believed in tonality and spent many, many, many years studying folk music. So this weird opening has the ghost of folk music in it. It's haunted by folk music, but it isn't folk music. And let's go on a little further with that. Let's go to where the earth trembled. Now we know that the earth trembled. Whoops, sorry. My iPad is flipping around. Okay. Where the earth trembled, actually, you know, we should go a little before that, so we're setting it up. Yeah, let's start, at the Adagio number 3, and you'll hear a tune that is his expression of love to Camilla. And let's keep going. You'll hear the tune many times. Each time, the shape of the melody is the same, but the intensity through these expressive chords is getting more and more intense. The tempo keeps changing. How many tempos are in this piece? Did you ever count? It's impossible, right? I mean, lots, right, correct, lots. Usually you have a movement that's primarily in one tempo, or it might have a slow introduction and go into a fast tempo, but it changes speed constantly because it's like real life. His feelings are changing. He's feeling emotional. He's trying to calm himself down. He gets crazy, he gets angry. So let's hear what happens to this tune. And I bet you can tell when the earth trembles. It doesn't stop there, but we agreed to stop there. You know, you keep thinking, oh, that's when it, no, that, oh, that, and then you realize, oh, it must be this. Because it gets bigger and more extraordinary and louder. And you might be thinking, oh, that must be it. It's not that great. That must be it. I don't, but then when it actually happens, it's unbelievable. And the reason it's unbelievable, well, I don't, maybe I shouldn't say the reason, but some aspect of its unbelievableness are that he keeps setting you up, and it gets more and more and more intense, so that when it explodes, it truly is overwhelming. But part of that is because of how high. Did you notice how high that violin part is? How high is it? Yeah. Yeah. Have you played higher than that ever?
Well, having to find it out of nowhere is pretty.
Yeah, it's pretty hard to find it.
It's challenging.
Yeah, it's pretty hard. You could think it's just really close to your face. That's the technique I learned for the. Okay, now before we hear this movement, so obviously when it explodes and the violin is very high, the earth is trembled. So we realize that the tune before that is him telling her he loved her, and when it starts to explode, it's probably the kiss, and then it explodes. Do you need to know all of this to think it's great music? No, you don't, but it's kind of nice. But also, my feeling is that knowing about a piece of music does help you appreciate it. It doesn't help you appreciate the music in its purest sense. Its intrinsic value is there. Its intrinsic beauty, it's all caught up in the notes. The notes are expressive. The notes are unconventional. The ranges are wildly out of proportion to what anybody else has done. The rhythms are all these pent up and then explosive little Strzasovkas. And it's really incredible. The other thing is that Janacek wrote a lot about music. And at one point, he often tries to write about how music is like life and even like biology. And I'm going to read to you two things that I think are extraordinary before we hear the whole thing through. Here we go. The first is Janacek, having heard a lecture by Professor Dr. Nachtigall, how appropriate, about biology and how he relates this to music. This is Janacek. There exists in each of us an inner environment. By this, Professor Dr. Nachtigall means the functioning of the inner organs. I add to that the sequences of all cognitive processes in general, all consciousness, all that has fallen into it, even perhaps unnoticed, disintegrates, collects, crisscrosses, pushes through, disappears, but never vanishes. What is important for us are the rhythmical pictures engendered by all our senses and its emotional accompaniment. Each of us in his creative soul with a strong inner environment projects differently either an augmented triad or some other harmony. That's amazing. And especially amazing if you compare it to this, which is written by neuroscientist Antonio Damasio about 10 years ago. It may be helpful to think of the behavior of an organism as the performance of a piece of music, whose score is being invented as it goes along. Just as the music you hear is the result of many groups of instruments playing together in time, he's talking orchestrally, the behavior of an organism is the result of several biological systems performing concurrently. The different groups of instruments produce different kinds of sounds and execute different kinds of melodies. They may play continuously throughout the piece or be absent at times, sometimes for a number of measures. Likewise, the behavior of a living organism. Now consider the extension, this is exactly like Janacek, consider an extension of this metaphor to the mind of the person whose performance we are observing. I propose that there is also an orchestral score in the private mind, only now the concurrent stacking of musical parts corresponds to mental streams of images. Those streams are largely the internal and cognitive counterpoint of the behaviors we observe. In the context of this metaphor, we can imagine the sense of self as an additional part which informs the mind, non-verbally, of the very existence of the organism in which that mind is unfolding. And he goes on about consciousness. It is a biologically derived, modern neuroscience, somewhat philosophical treatise that sounds almost exactly like a composer named Janacek writing in 1928. And it's because Janacek, when he screams, "It's the truth," in a letter, and he looks like he's screaming, he really got at truth in music. And, yes, Beethoven did, Mozart did, Bach did, there are different kinds of truth. But he got into a kind of an emotional, personal level that was made possible only by an extremism of isolation, of fantasy, and even in a way of his age at that time. And so he broke a lot of rules. He didn't really extend the way people write music the way Beethoven did. He just did his thing in a private world. Of course, a lot of music written since Janacek, a huge amount of it, does use his techniques in some way or other. But it's not that he extended the language in a normal way, it's just people are trying to copy Janacek, and it's hard not to for a lot of people. Okay, so it's time now to hear the entire third movement, which is the one where the earth shakes. And if you have a seatbelt, it's time to use it.